Hi and welcome back to the Journey to Nebula Sew Along. I'm Julie Herman of Jaybird Quilts and I'll be your guide on this journey. This week we are going to work on piecing the candy dish pillow using the hexagons and triangles that we cut last week. Let's get started. So first I want to remind everyone that last week I suggested cutting off all 3 points of your triangles. This is going to help with alignment during our initial step as well as subsequent steps. It's not required, so you can kind of get a feel for whether you want to take the extra time to do that, but I highly suggest it. So we're going to work on piecing our triangles to our hexagons, and most of our pieces are going to be 2 triangles to 1 hexagon. Some of your ones on the end are just going to be 1, or they might even be 3. You'll follow your pattern to see where that happens. So I'm going to spread these apart so you can see them a little better. So where we're going to begin is pinning our triangles to our hexagon. And because we have cut both edges off, we know exactly where to line it up. So we can begin to line them up and pin them in place. And if you're wondering about grain, your hexagons should all be grain, straight of grain this way. If you cut them from your charm squares or your strips, depending on if you have a motif that you might have fussy cut or done something, you can always turn it and that's okay. Your grain doesn't have to stay horizontal, but most people find it's a little bit easier. And then your triangles, you want to keep your grain that way as well, so that in this early step, we're sewing bias to bias, and that will give us a straight all the way across the top and the bottom, which will help when we go to assemble our rows. So go ahead and line up all of your triangles to your hexagons and pin them in place, and I will see you on over at the sewing machine. Now that we have everything pinned, we're on over at our sewing machine so that we can get started on piecing. And we're going to use the same machine settings that we've been using so far in the journey, which is a scant 1/4 inch seam, a 2.5 stitch length, and I'm sewing with R-Fill 50 weight 2600 because it's my favorite medium gray. And we're going to go ahead and begin sewing our 1/4 inch seam to sew our triangles to our hexagons. And you're probably familiar at this point that I often don't pin. I did pin all of these, and that's mainly so that I don't lose track of which triangles go where. So I will often pull the pins out before I begin. That is absolutely not necessary if you prefer to leave the pins in. Go ahead, just don't sew over your pins, pull them out before you get to your needle. So get this lined up. I'm just going to sew my 1/4 inch seam. And this project is a great opportunity to chain piece. If you've never chain pieced before, it is just sewing from one piece to the next, basically making a long chain of pieces. And then we'll just go ahead and snip in between them at the end of sewing them all. It helps you save time. It helps you save thread. So I am just going to keep sewing my 1/4 inch seam. And as I mentioned earlier, most of these have 2 triangles. Some of them have 1 and some have 3. The ones are easy, just sew the 1. But I'm going to show you what I do in the case of the 3. There are 2 different ones in your candy dish pillow that have 3. So I started with that one so I'd be able to show you. So I'm going to just cut these apart. Okay, so this is mine that is going to have 3. It's going to have this one added right here. So what I'm going to do is use my handy dandy seam roller to roll this seam open. I could turn my iron on just for this one, but as I mentioned, there's only 2 pieces that get 3, and I find I can get my seam pressed pretty flat with my seam roller just to make sure that one area where it's going to intersect. And so then I'll take this triangle and I'm going to line it up on the bottom here. And as you'll see, it goes a 1/4 inch past the seam, which is exactly what it should do. So in this case, I will lift my presser foot and I will stick this piece underneath, and I'll begin sewing a little bit before that piece starts. And just like any other piece then, I will continue sewing to the end. So I'm going to keep going with my stack here, sewing all of my triangles on. Now that I have sewn all of my triangles to my hexagons, it is time to press them open. And this is another project where I highly suggest pressing open because they will not nest in the next step, and it will help you significantly getting them to lay flat if you take the time to go ahead and press them open. So I'm gonna go ahead on each of my pieces, press my seams open. Now that I have gone ahead and pressed all of my seams open, I've laid all my pieces back out on my design wall, and the next step is to begin sewing these together to complete our rows. So this is where it's going to be very helpful that we went ahead and cut off all of our notched points because things are going to align perfectly as a result. So we're going to take our first piece, flip it down on over our second one, and the edge of our hexagon is going to go right on our notch, the notch on our hexagon, and the center is going to be 1/4 of an inch off, and that's exactly what we want, so that 1/4 of an inch in is where those lines are going to intersect, so that once we sew our 1/4 inch seam, our points will line up perfectly. So I'm going to take 2 little pins to pin those 2 together, then I'm going to repeat that process with these and continue pinning everything together in pairs. We're now going to work on piecing our row together, and I have all of my pieces pinned, so I'm just going to go ahead, sew my scant 1/4 of an inch seam. And as I mentioned, these are off by 1/4 of an inch here, and that's what we want, so that the 2 diagonal lines, the point will match in the middle once I sew my 1/4 inch seam. Make sure I keep those lined up. Use my stiletto as I need to make sure I don't flip any seams. Keep this lined up. And just continue chain piecing all of my pieces together until I have all of my rows complete. Now that I have my row complete, it's time to press these seams open. And I want to press these open as well because when I go to piece my rows, again, things are not going to be able to be nested. So in order to lay as flat as possible, I want to press them open. So I should have mentioned earlier, I don't have the steam on because it makes a little bit too much noise when filming, but I am a fan of steam. So if you are a fan of steam as well, I highly suggest pressing with steam on your iron. So I'm just going to go ahead and open these first with my finger. Got my heat resistant stiletto here, and I'm going to go ahead and press these seams. And gentle reminder, pressing, not ironing. Ironing's when we go back and forth. Pressing's up and down with a little wiggle. If we go ahead and iron this as opposed to press this, we can easily distort our seams since we are working with a good amount of bias here. So go ahead, press the seams in each of your rows. Now that I have each of my rows pieced, it's time to piece them together to complete my pillow top. And the alignment of sewing these rows together is going to be different than anything we've done so far. The alignment guide for ourselves is actually in the seam allowance. So what we're going to do is take our first row and we're going to flip it down onto our second row. And I'm going to zoom in to make sure that you can see what we're going to line up. Okay, so, all right, I think you guys can see. Great. So what we are going to do is we've pressed our seams open. And so we have this, and that's what we're going to be lining up with our points here and here. So that we have that same 1/4 of an inch overlap that we had on our points when sewing our diamonds to each other, so that everything will line up perfectly once we sew our 1/4 inch seam. So this tiny little part of our is lining up with our seam on the one side, so we're going to go ahead and pin. And then same thing here is this corner is lining up where that seam intersects on that side. And then we're going to repeat this to pin all the way across the entire strip. The key to accurately sewing our rows together is lots of pins and slow and steady. We're going to sew this very slowly checking each intersection that we have pinned as we go, and you'll see I've got one little bubble here that I'm going to do my best to ease in so that I can keep all my points matching. So I'm going to use my stiletto as I get close to a seam. Make sure to never sew over your pins, so pull them out as we go. Use my stiletto to make sure I don't flip any of my seams and that I stay as lined up as best as possible. And then here's where I've got that bubble. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gently gonna pull down here a little bit, and it's gonna flatten that out. Now this is only something you can do if it's off by, I would say, 1/8 or less. If you're off by more than 1/8, you can't usually ease a bubble in. But it's worth trying rather than taking everything apart to figure out why it's not lining up perfectly, because it should. I mean, it's like a puzzle, but even I end up sometimes with pieces that are just slightly a tiny bit off. And continue to use my stiletto and sew my 1/4 inch seam. Make sure I don't flip that one over there. Pull this pin out. Got another little bubble here, not nearly as big as the last one. I can get that one eased in pretty well. Pull this out. And I'm just gonna keep sewing. So there we go. I'm gonna repeat that step with each of my rows till I have all my rows pieced together. Now that I have my rows pieced together, I'm gonna open it up, do a quick little check, make sure most of my points line up pretty well, and then go ahead and press the seam. Now at this point, I will press this seam open, but this seam can be pressed in whatever direction makes the most sense to you, because we are done and there's no more things that are going to be intersecting this. So if it's easier for you to press it in one direction or another, that is totally fine as well. I'm just going to press it open because that's what I tend to do. And once I've started pressing a project open, I like to generally stay consistent unless there's a specific reason not to. So I'm going to go ahead and get my stiletto to help me press this open. After you have sewn all your rows and pressed them, you will have a completed candy dish pillow top. And one item of note is that I don't trim this down until after it's quilted. Sometimes things don't evenly shrink in both directions. So what I'll do is I'll quilt this and I'll measure my top to my bottom. It's not always 16.5 anymore, it might be 16.25. Whatever that measurement is, I will go ahead and cut my width to match. And I used line work here and I love the look of what I came up with. But one thing is, I used the cotton sateen for my hexagons because I had a scrap left over from my backing. And if I did this again, I would probably just use the smaller scale of the sketchy print, because the cotton sateen I've never actually pieced with 100% quilting cotton at the same time. And you'll see I've got some bubbles here because it definitely is a little stretchier and handled a little bit different. It's kind of a challenge, but I don't know that I would necessarily do it again. So go ahead and put together your candy dish top and then post your progress to Instagram and use the hashtag Journey to Nebula to be entered in this week's giveaway. If you have any questions, leave a comment wherever you're watching this video. And I look forward to seeing you here back next week to begin working on gazebo.